Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today Hashem Dav Chaf Zayin Amid Beis. So we are continuing to learn Hilchos Tzitzis and we find ourselves in the midst of what has turned out to be a very, very complex Siman Tes Vav, the halachas that pertain to tzitzits that have become torn in various ways. Yesterday we learned the very complex halachas, really the last 2 days, of trying to transplant a corner of a beged complete with its tzitzits either to a second beged or to reattach it to the original beged. Turned out to be a very complex sugya. Today's limud is somewhat easier. We begin Siman Tes Vav Sif Hey, the last two words of Daf Chav Zayin Amen Aleph. Says the Mechaber, Nikra talis. If a talis became torn, Toich Shalosh Etzbois, within 3 finger breadths, Samuch Lisvas Hakanaf, close to the end of the corner. So you have a talis cotton. Let's grab my trusty talis cotton over here. You have a talis cotton and it becomes torn, and it's torn within 3 finger breadths of the end of the garment. Okay, so that's where it's torn. 3 finger breadths. We're generally speaking approximately how many? About 5 centimeters, approximately. So the tzitzits became torn close to the end of the beged. Now, when we speak about the end of the beged, we could be talking about the bottom of the beged, or we could be talking about the side of the beged. So we're talking about the end of the beged, either on the vertical or on the horizontal axis. It doesn't matter. But the beged ripped within 3 finger breadths of the end of the beged. Says the Mechaber here, top line, Chav Zayin Amud Beis, Einoi Rashoy L'Tafroi. You are not allowed to repair it. You're not allowed to stitch it back up. Okay, what's the problem here? So here we're going to have a machlokes Rashi and Rav Amram. This comes from a Gemara in Menachos, but the Gemara is understood differently by Rashi and Rav Amram. And in Rav Amram, we're going to have 2 different pshatim. So first, the Mechaber begins with Rashi. Upirish Rashi, Rashi's explanation of this halacha is, what's the problem with repairing the garment within 3 finger breadths of the end of the garment? Because we are concerned that when you repair the beged, sheyishtayer michut hatfira, when you stitch up the beged, so you're introducing a thread into the beged, right? You take a needle and thread, or you take a sewing machine, and you make your repair. We are concerned, sheyishtayer michut hatfira, there will be a piece left over from the thread that you use to stitch the beged. Normally, when you finish sewing, you have a long piece of thread hanging off. You would take a scissor and you would snip it. But what we're afraid of is, v'yanichenu, instead of snipping off that thread, you'll use that thread. You'll leave it there. V'yanichenu. V'yosef alav shiva chutin, and then you'll add another 7 threads to that thread. L'shem tzitzits. So in other words, what Rashi says is like this. You have a beged of daled kanfos that's chayiv in tzitzits. It tears at the bottom within 3 finger breadths of the corner. Now, what's the yichus? What's significant about 3 finger breadths off the end of the beged? Let's remember where you're supposed to put the tzitzits. The tzitzits are supposed to be placed the one kesher agudel, right? 1 measurement from the knuckle to the tip of the thumb off the bottom and off the side of the beged. It's not allowed to be lower than that, because if it's closer to the end of the beged, that would be called tachas hakanaf, not al hakanaf. So it's got to be higher and more inboard than that amount. But it cannot be more than 3 finger breadths above the bottom or off the side, because then it's not called al hakanaf, then it's called al habeged. Then it's the tzitzits are on the beged proper, they're not on the corner of the beged. So that area, the area that is in between a kesher agudel and 3 finger breadths off the bottom and off the side of the beged, that's the proper placement of tzitzits. Now, says Rashi, if the beged tears in that area, and then you go ahead and you repair it, you might say to yourself, I have this leftover thread that's coming off of the precise area where the tzitzits are supposed to be. You know what I'll do? I'll get another 7 strings, and I'll incorporate that hanging thread into the tzitzits. Now that would be puzzle. Why would it be puzzle? Well, there's one very simple reason why it would be puzzle, and that is that you need lishma. The tzitzits have to be put on the beged l'shem mitzvahs tzitzits. Now this thread was not put onto the beged l'shem tzitzits. This thread was put there as part of a sewing repair. It's not l'shem tzitzits. So you're not mekayim lishma with that thread, and therefore that thread is right away puzzle for tzitzits. So again, the Mechaber says, if you get a tear in the beged within 3 finger breadths off the bottom, and the Mishnah Berurah is going to say not anywhere within the 3 finger breadths. It also has to be an agudel, a kesher agudel, away from the bottom or from the side, because if it's that close to the bottom or that close to the side, less than a kesher agudel, over there you're not allowed to put tzitzits. So it has to be, according to Rashi, this halacha applies in the area where you're allowed to put tzitzits. If you get a tear in the beged, in the area where you are allowed to put the tzitzits, you cannot make a sewing repair, lest you have a leftover thread from the sewing repair, and lest you be tempted to incorporate that into the tzitzits, and that would be puzzle. So let's see it inside again. Top line here in the Mechaber, Chav Zayin Amud Beis, Upirish Rashi. Rashi explains the Gemara that prohibits the sewing repair, and he says the problem is the Chayshina that we are concerned, Sheyishtayar Michut HaTfira, there will be something left over from the thread that you use for the stitching, for your repair, V'yanichenu, and you will leave it there attached to the garment instead of snipping it off, V'yosef alav shiva chutin, and then you will add on another 7 strings, l'shem tzitzits, to make tzitzits out of it, and that would be puzzle. Uletamzeh, and following this reasoning, says the Mechaber, afilu nikra kolshu, even if you get a small tear within that area of the beged, lo yitvar, you're not allowed to sew it, right? Because the whole rationale of Rashi is you cannot have a sewing repair in the area where you put the tzitzits, because you might incorporate the thread from the repair into the tzitzits. So does it matter how large of a tear you get in the beged? No. Whatever kind of tear you might have in the beged that's going to require a sewing repair, you're not allowed to do any sewing repair in that area of the beged. Ulefizeh, and furthermore, says the Mechaber, according to the rationale of Rashi, there's another interesting thing that comes out. Talis shel tzemer. If you have a woolen beged, many of us use woolen tzitzits. If you have a woolen beged, shenikra toich shalosh, that tore in this area within 3 finger breadths where you're allowed to place the tzitzits, mutter litvar. A woolen beged you would be allowed to repair. Why? Says the Mechaber, ha'idna, nowadays, at least at the time of the Chavetz Chaim, the time of the Mechaber says you would be allowed to make that repair. Why? De'ein derech litvar b'chutei tzemer. Because apparently in the time of the Mechaber, I would have to ask my wife nowadays, but the time of the Mechaber, it was not common to use woolen sewing thread. They didn't make sewing repairs using woolen thread. They wove garments out of wool, but they did not use woolen thread to stitch up a repair. Now, let's remember, a woolen garment can only have tzitzits of wool. Back in the day when we had talis, you could also use tzitzits of pishtan, of linen. But now that we don't have talis, so like the Mishnah Berurah explained early on, we're not mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzits karoi in the fully proper way, and therefore we're not allowed to make shatnez. So if you have a beged of tzemer, the only type of tzitzits that you could use to pater the beged is woolen tzitzit strings. You can't use cotton tzitzit strings in a woolen beged. Let's remember, wool and flax linen strings are universal. They could pater any kind of beged. Any other beged, you need the same fabric as the beged in the tzitzit strings. So you want to pater a cotton beged, you need either cotton tzitzit strings or woolen tzitzit strings. You want to pater a silk beged, you need either silk tzitzit strings or woolen tzitzit strings. But if you have a wool beged, the only thing that you could use is wool. And if you don't make sewing repairs out of wool, then the Mechaber says, according to Rashi, you could do a sewing repair in the bottom or the side 3 finger breadths of the beged. Why? Because you're not going to use woolen thread to make the repair. So what are you going to use? Cotton thread? We're not worried that you're going to incorporate a cotton thread into the tzitzit strings of a woolen garment, because you know that you can't use cotton to pater wool. You're going to use silk thread to make the sewing repair. We're not chayshish that you're going to try to incorporate a silk thread into tzitzit strings for a woolen garment, because you know you need wool. So another outcome of Rashi is, since the whole reason you can't make the sewing repair is because we're afraid you're going to incorporate the thread into the tzitzits, if you have a woolen beged, it's not an issue, because you don't use wool thread, and any other kind of thread, we're not chayshish that you're going to try and incorporate it into your tzitzit strings. Okay, so that's the sheet of Rashi. Now let's go to the sheet of Rav Amram. 4 lines down in the Mechaber. Again, we're giving 2 different pshatim here in why the Gemara says that if you have a tear in your tzitzits, a tear in your beged, within 3 finger breadths of the bottom or the side, you're not allowed to make a sewing repair. So we saw the pshat of Rashi, now we see the pshat of Rav Amram. For Rav Amram Piresh, Rav Amram explains the time that the reason for this isser is Mishum denikra toich shalosh, if the beged tears within 3 finger breadths. Well, what does that mean? That means, and we're going to see that according to Rav Amram, this isser only applies if a piece actually tears off. According to Rashi, the problem is, even if there's a small tear, anything that requires a repair, you're not allowed to make a repair. According to Rav Amram, we're talking about that a piece of the beged actually tore off. Now, Rav Amram says like this: if a piece of the beged tears off on the bottom 3 finger breadths or on the side 3 finger breadths, that means that that piece that tore off is less than shalosh al shalosh. It's less than 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths. Now, we learn in the halachas of Tumah and Tahara that a beged, a piece of fabric that is smaller than shalosh al shalosh, is not called a beged. It's not significant. Why? Because a significant piece of fabric is a piece of fabric that could be used to make a patch for clothing. And the Gemara tells us that the minimum size for that is shalosh al shalosh. So less than shalosh al shalosh has no chashivas. It's not considered a beged. Says Rav Amram, you know what the problem over here is? The problem is the Gemara is talking about where a piece of the fabric at the bottom or on the side of the talis or of the talis cotton tore off. And that piece is not shalosh at spice. It does, so if it's not shalosh at spice, it's not shalosh al shalosh. If it's not shalosh al shalosh, it's not chashiv a beged. It has no chashivas. If it has no chashivas, says Rav Amram, even if you now go and reattach it to the beged, that section of the beged is not chashiv. If you have a woven beged, that's all one piece. So the entire beged, even the bottom shalish at spice, or the sidemost shalish at spice, I don't know if that's a word. If it's not, I just made it up. Has chashivas, because it's a woven part of a larger beged. But, says Rav Amram, if a piece that's less than shalish al shalish tears off, and now you go to reattach it, since when it was torn off, it had no chashivus, when you reattach it, it still doesn't have chashivus. We don't say that when you reattach it, it becomes once again part of the larger beged. No, it's an addendum to the beged. It's an add-on. You stitched on a piece, and that piece is not big enough to be chashiv. And if it's not big enough to be chashiv, you can't put tzitzits on it. Because then the tzitzits is on a part of the beged that has no chashivas. And that doesn't work. So Rav Amram says, there's two very different views of the Isser of the Gemara. According to Rashi, the Isser is any tear that happens to the beged within the bottom 3 finger breadths or the side 3 finger breadths, any kind of tear. You're not allowed to make any sewing repairs in that area. Why? Because you can have a leftover thread, you might incorporate it into your tzitzits, and that's also because it's not lishma. So no sewing repairs in that area of the beged. According to Rav Amram, the Isser is a very different Isser. According to Rav Amram, the Isser is if a piece of your beged rips off, and that piece is not shalosh al shalosh, you cannot reattach it. Because if you reattach it, it's not chashiv, it's keman de lesa dummy, it's as if it's not there, and you can't attach tzitzits to it. Because to have tzitzits on that piece means that you don't really have tzitzits on the beged, because it's keman de lesa dummy, it's as if it's not there. Let's see it inside. Rav Amram Piresh, Rav Amram explains this Gemara and he says the time of the rationale is Mishum de Nikrat Toich Shalosh, when you get a tear within the bottommost or the sidemost 3 etzbois, 3 finger breadths of the beged, less bei toiras beged. That piece, that section, is not considered a beged. It's too small. We learn that out from the halachas of Tum and Tahara. Va'afal gav de tefaroi, and even if you sew it back on and reattach it, keman de pasik chashuv, it's considered as if it's still unattached. The sewing repair that you do to sew that piece back on, we don't recognize it. It's as if it's not there. It's as if it's not attached. V'i aved bei tzitzits, and if you put tzitzits on that piece of the beged, loy patar la talis, it doesn't pater the beged from its chiyuv of tzitzits, because it's as if it's not there. Ula pirish is there, and according to this explanation of the Gemara in Menachos, says the Machaber, im nikra, if the beged would become torn, v'nishtayer kol shehu, but the piece that's torn is not completely torn off, it still remains somewhat attached, nishtayer kol shehu, there's a minute amount of attachment still left to the beged, so this section didn't tear off, it's still attached. Kosher. In that case, it's still kosher, because, no problem, it's not torn off, it's still part of the beged. V'yesh omrim, and then there is another explanation of Rav Amram, and this is a Nemuke Yosef. V'yesh omrim, there are those that say, the Nemuke Yosef, the Rav Amram, that according to the Pirush of Rav Amram, loy nifsal, the first explanation of Rav Amram holds that, again, if a section of the talis tore off, so there's 2 ways you can have this. Let's say you have a beged of talis kanfus that doesn't have tzitzits on it yet. So a piece tore off. Now you go ahead and you reattach it. The first explanation that we have here in Rav Amram would say, now you want to go put tzitzits on that beged. Could you put tzitzits on that piece that had torn off and was now reattached? No, you cannot. Why? Because it's as if it's not reattached. It's not choshev. It doesn't have a teres beged, so it's as if it's not there. If you attach tzitzits to that section of the beged, you don't pot to the beged. Now, case number 2. You had a talis cotton, complete with tzitzits. A section tore off. Now you want to reattach it. According to the first pshat in Rav Amram, again, doesn't work. No good. Because you put it back on, it's as if it's not there. Now we're going to attack some of yesterday's problems with this case as well. Tasav, Elohim, Asi, etc., etc. We'll see that in the Mishnah Berurah. But now we have a second pshat, Rav Amram. V'yesh omrim. The Rav Amram loy nifsal el tzitzits shahaya bay be'eis shetfaroi. The Nemuke Yosef holds that what Rav Amram says is, the only problem is if there already were tzitzits on the beged, and now the section tore off and you reattach it, that's no good. Avo, im acher shetfaroi hitl bat tzitzits, but if what happened was there were no tzitzits, a piece tore off, you reattached it, and now you want to attach tzitzits to that, that's okay. V'yirei shamayim yotzes kula beichad efsher. And the Mechaber says Yirei shamayim should be yotze all of these shitas. Okay, so we had a lot here. We did the entire Mechaber here of Sif Daled. Now let's tackle the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut you a toy shalosh et spice. We're talking about a case where the beged ripped within 3 finger breadths of either the bottom or the side of the beged. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ava lamayla mishalosh et spice. But if there's a tear higher than that area, higher than gimel et spice, or more inboard horizontally than 3 et spice, yakalu tafre l'kulayalma. Everybody would hold you're allowed to make a sewing repair somewhere in the middle of the beged. Dilapirish Rashi, because according to Rashi, it's not problematic. Haloi sham ein mokem tzitzits. You're not allowed to affix tzitzits to the beged in the middle of the beged. According to Rashi, the whole problem is you might incorporate the leftover thread from the sewing repair into the tzitzits. That's not a concern in the middle of the beged because you can't attach tzitzits in the middle of the beged. Kanal Siman Yud Aleph, like we saw earlier in Siman Yud Aleph Sif Tes. And therefore we do not need to be concerned that you might take the leftover thread from the sewing repair and incorporate it into your tzitzis. Ulapirish Rav Amram Goyin, and according to Rav Amram, there's also no problem if you do a sewing repair in middle of the beged. Why? Because the whole problem, according to Rav Amram, is that the section that tore off does not have a Torah's beged. It's not big enough. It's not shalosh al shalosh. But if you have a big piece of the beged that rips off, and now you want to reattach it, according to Rav Amram, there's no problem. It never lost the Torah's beged. Even when it was unattached, it was considered a beged. When you reattach it, you're attaching one beged to another beged. And that has chashivus. So now it's all considered one beged. It's only when a small piece that doesn't have chashivus gets reattached to the beged that we don't recognize the reattachment. Continues the Chavetz Chaim. Even if the corner of the beged was torn off of the beged above 3 etzbais, together with its tzitzits, you could reattach the corner. V'hatzitzit's kosher, and the tzitzits are kosher. Now, if you're paying attention, your curiosity just got piqued, because this goes right into what we discussed yesterday. Boy, it's scary to go back into that. But what did the Mishnah Berurah just say, right? The Mishnah Berurah just said, both according to Rashi and according to Rav Amram, if there's a tear that's in the middle of the beged somewhere, you're allowed to repair it. According to Rashi, a sewing repair in that area is no problem. You can't put tzitzits in that area. According to Rav Amram, it's also not a problem. Because what? A piece got torn off of the beged. Okay, how big is it? If it's more than shalosh al shalosh, it has Torah's beged. If it has Torah's beged, you're allowed to reattach it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that means even if the corner of the beged got completely torn off the beged, but the piece that got torn off is bigger than shalosh al shalosh, and it got torn off together with its tzitzits, you're allowed to reattach it. Now, that's quite a mouthful for the Mishnah Berurah to say, because he says right away, Va'ataz polik. The Taz disagrees with that. Upaisik, the Taz paskins, that if that would happen, you would have to take the tzitzits off of that corner, and then to reattach the tzitzits, to tie the tzitzits back on after you make your sewing repair. Why? Tasav v'loim and asui, right? And if you take a look at the Sharat Tziyah, nice Kotlachav Gimel, when the Mishnah Berurah said you're allowed to do this, Muchach kein Mishulchan Aruch Gufa v'chein Kasav Magen Avram. This is yesterday's Magen Avram, right? The Magen Avram said, if you have a corner that tears off the garment together with its tzitzits, and now you want to reattach it to the original garment, even though the tzitzits became puzzle while it was torn off, because while it was torn off, it was attached to a corner that's not big enough to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. You're still allowed to reattach it, and there's no tasav v'loim and asui. Why? Because since you're reattaching it to the original beged, we look at it as if it was never detached. That was the Magen Avram. The Taz says no. If it got ripped off of the beged, now it's possible because it's only attached to a small corner. Now if you want to reattach it even to the original garment, you have to untie the tzitzits, sew the corner back onto the beged, and then retie on the tzitzits lishma. Otherwise it's tasav limud asli. So here we have another manifestation of yesterday's machlokes, the Magen Avram and the Taz, v'yesh lahachmir, and the Mishnah Berurah says we should be machmir like the Taz, the kanal b'sif katan zayin. Okay. But for today's purposes, the takeaway of Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Yud is that this whole problem, this whole issue, is when the tear in the beged is within the bottom 3 finger breadths or the sidemost 3 finger breadths. But if it's inboard, if it's in the middle of the beged, according to Rashi, there's no problem. According to Rav Amram, his problem is also not negeya. We have the question of the Magen Avram and the Taz. Fine, we have to view it within that context as well, whether or not you have to remove the tzitzits and put the tzitzits on again because of tasav limud asli. Eis Katan Yud Aleph, bechutei tzemer. What did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber said, according to Rashi, that the whole problem of the sewing repair is the concern you might take the thread from the sewing repair and incorporate it into your tzitzits. So the Mechaber said, that's not a problem if you're doing a sewing repair on a beged of tzemer. Why? Because a beged of tzemer, the tzitzits must be tzemer. You can't use any other kind of fabric to make tzitzit strings for a beged shel tzemer. And, said the Mechaber, at least in his time, they did not use woolen sewing thread. So there's no concern that you might try to incorporate the leftover sewing thread into the tzitzits, because everybody knows that if it's not wool, you can't use it for tzitzits. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud Aleph, b'chutei tzemer ela b'shar minim. The custom was to only use sewing threads made out of different fabrics. V'hakol yodim, and everybody knows, says the Mechaber, sheshar minim, that other types of fabric ein patron b'tzemer, cannot pater a beged shel tzemer from its chiyuv of tzitzits. Only woolen tzitzit strings can do that. Imkain, and if so, lo yavai l'tzarif achut. There's no concern that you're going to come to incorporate the leftover thread into the tzitzits. V'hu adin, and the same din would apply to yesh lahakel gam bishar minim. This also yields a kula by other types of begadim in taifrei b'min acher. For example, let's say you have a beged of dalet kanfais made out of silk. So if you want to do a sewing repair using silk thread, according to Rashi, you can't do that, because then there's a concern you might try to incorporate that leftover silk thread into your silken tzitzit strings. But let's say you have a talis cotton made out of silk, and now you want to do a sewing repair using cotton thread. That, according to Rashi, would be okay, because again, there's no concern that you might try to incorporate your cotton thread into the tzitzit strings, because you know that for a silken beged, you must have silken tzitzit strings. So you can't incorporate this cotton thread. Eis Katan Yud Beis. Now we go into the pirush of Rav Amram. Rav Amram said that the problem is, that according to Rav Amram, Pshat, the Gemara in Menachos is very different. According to Rav Amram, the Gemara in Menachos is talking about a case not where there was a tear that needs a repair. The Gemara in Menachos, according to Rav Amram, is talking about where a section of the beged was torn off, and the isser is to reattach it. Why is it a problem? Because since it's less than shalosh al shalosh, it's not choshev, and therefore the reattachment is not considered a reattachment. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud Beis, Mishum the Nikra. Says the Chavetz Chaim, a simple reading of the Mechaber sounds like this is only an issue if a piece tore off and you want to reattach it. How about if a piece never tore off? You are making a talis cotton l'chatchila. So you wove a beged, and it's a very nice beged, but then you decided that you want it to be a little bit longer. Or maybe you decided that you want to sew a beautiful piece of trim onto the bottom. So we're not talking about a case where it tore off and you reattached it. No, you just decided you want to stitch on a nice piece of trim on the bottom of the talis cotton. And that piece of trim is going to be less than shalosh al shalosh. According to Rav Amram, that's also a problem. Because if it's less than shalosh al shalosh, it has no tairas beged. And that piece of trim is not choshuv. And since it's not choshuv, when you stitch it onto the beged, it's not considered part of the beged. It's keman delesa dummy. And now if you want to put tzitzits on that trim, that tzitzits doesn't pater the beged because it's not viewed as being on the beged. So this is what the Mishnah Berurah says here. Let's cut your base. Hu adin, the same halacha applies not only if a piece tore off. Hu adin l'chatchila, if at the beginning when you made the beged, be'es asiyas ha-beged, tafar chatichas beged, you sewed on a section of beged, pachas mishalosh, that is less than 3 finger breadths, lisvas ha-beged, onto the edge of the beged, hein ba'orich, whether it's on the length, hen b'roichav, or on the width. V'hitol by tzitzis b'chatichazu, and now you try to tie the tzitzis strings onto that piece. Psula l'didei. According to Rav Amram, this would be possible. To have a command to pasik, because it's considered as if that piece of trim isn't even attached. Av shetvar la beged, even though you sewed it on. So now, you might say, okay, so you know how I'll avoid the problem? I sewed a piece of trim onto the bottom of the beged. That piece of trim is a drop less than 3 finger breadths wide. You're telling me I can't put tzitzits over there. Why? Because it's considered as if that piece is not even attached to the beged. Okay, so you know what I'll do? I'll put the tzitzits above it. I'll go above the piece of trim. I'll make a hole, and I'll put the tzitzits over there. Says the Mishnah Berurah, not so simple. If you try to put the tzitzits above that piece of trim, it's very easy that you're going to get into trouble. Because let's say that piece of trim is just a drop less than gimel et spice. Now you want to put the tzitzits above it. You can't put the tzitzits mamish right above it. It's going to be very hard to make a hole over there and put the tzitzits in. So you're going to go a drop higher. If you go a drop higher, you're more than 3 et spice off the bottom of the beged. Why? Because in the context of that halacha, the piece of trim that you attached counts. See, it's not considered part of the beged, so that you should be able to put the tzitzits on it. But it is considered part of the beged as far as the measurements for the proper placement of the tzitzits. And the proper placement of the tzitzits is within gimel et spice of the bottom of the beged. So if this piece of trim is a drop less than gimel et spice, and you try to put the tzitzits above it, it's very likely you're going to end up putting the tzitzits more than 3 et spice off the bottom of the beged. Now the tzitzits are not in the proper place, and it's puzzle. So it says the Mishnah Berurah, V'em yatel tzitzis l'mayla me'yoisa katicha atfura, yiu atzitzis rechoikim m'ktzei ha'beged yoisa b'shalish et spice u'puzzle. Al kain, therefore, what should you do to solve the problem? If you do have this talis cotton, you stitched on a piece of trim on the bottom, and now you realize you're doing your chazara of Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, and you realize you got a problem. You put on this piece of trim, you can't put the tzitzits on the trim, you can't put the tzitzits over the trim. What should you do? So the Mishnah Berurah gives us an eitzah. Mishnah Berurah says, Al kain, therefore, yireh, you should see to it, as then, litfar tachas hakanaf, to sew underneath the corner. Now, I believe that when the Mishnah Berurah says underneath the corner, he does not mean in the height. In other words, here's the talis cotton. You went ahead, you stitched on a piece of trim onto the bottom over here, going down. Now he's telling you, put on another piece under it. He doesn't mean under it going further down. What he means when he says under it, he means under it, meaning on the inside. What should you do? You should take a piece of fabric. Let me find the place here again. Al ken yira oz litfar takas hakanaf. So, underneath, meaning on the inside. And it doesn't matter inside or outside. Chatichas beged, a piece of cloth, shel shalosh, al shalosh. That is more than 3 by 3. So what he's saying is like this. If you take a look at my talis cotton here, and most of our talis cottons are this way, you see this square of fabric that's stitched onto the talis cotton? This is a separate piece of fabric, and it is more than gimel al gimel. You know why? Because this piece is chashuv to be a beged on its own. So what the Mishnah Berurah is telling you is, if you ran into a problem because this area of your beged is puzzle for tzitzits, because you stitched on over here a piece that was less than gimel al gimel, and you can't put the tzitzits on a piece that's less than gimel al gimel, because even though it's attached to the beged, Rav Amram says we don't recognize that attachment, and therefore the tzitzits aren't on the beged. So what should you do? Take another piece of fabric that is gimel al gimel and stitch it on to the beged, and attach the tzitzits to that. Now, even though the tzitzits will be attached to that piece and whatever's under it, but it doesn't matter. The bottom line is it is attached to this piece. And the attachment of this piece to the larger beged, we do recognize, because this is a beged on its own, this is a beged on its own. When you stitch them together, you attach one beged to another beged. That's chashuv. Now it's all one beged. So now, when you put the tzitzits on, you're putting it on the beged. That's okay. So that's the way you solve the problem. We find a place here. And the Mishnah Berurah tells us to look further in Sif Tezayin, where the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us that this is why all of our talis cottons and all of our talis gadol, they all have that piece of cloth, that square of cloth, sewn onto the corner. You know why? Because we don't want to take any chances that there was a piece that was torn off and reattached where you're putting the tzitzits on. We always want to know that the tzitzits are placed onto a piece of fabric that is more than gimel al gimel, and it's intact, and it has taras beged. That's why we always stitch a separate piece of cloth that's gimel al gimel onto the corner of our talis cotton and our talis gadol. Even though, interestingly enough, the Chazon Ish says there's absolutely no reason for that chumrah, but that's what we do. Okay. Ice cotton yud gimel. So we hear in the Pirush of Rav Amram, and Rav Amram said, a piece tore off, it's less than gimel al gimel, you want to reattach it, we don't recognize the reattachment. Because the piece that tore off was less than gimel al gimel, it's not choshev. Even when you attach it, we don't recognize that it's there. You put the tzitzits on it, it doesn't pater the beged. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton yud gimel v'i avad, if you put tzitzits on it, it's not efficacious. Rotza loymar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, afilu asa tzitzits chadoshim b'chatikas hakonof hahu acher shetvorei la talis. The case that the Mechaber gives in the Pirush of Rav Amram is, even if you put tzitzits on that corner, it won't pater the beged. What the Mechaber is telling you is, realize that it's not only a problem of tasav v'lo ben asui. Even if after you restitch, if after you reattach that piece to the beged, you go and you tie new tzitzits to it, it's still a problem. Why? I have mamish and asiyah lishma, everything. I don't have tasav v'lo ben asui. No, it's a problem anyway, because you're putting tzitzits onto a part of the beged that we don't recognize as being attached to the beged. Because the sewing, the stitching, is not considered an attachment, and it's considered as if it's still detached. If the piece had ripped completely off the beged, even though you reattach it now, we don't recognize it as being reattached. Ice cotton yadalid, the Mechaber said, but what does come out from Rav Amram, different than Rashi, is that according to Rashi, there's always a problem. Any tear that happens within the bottom or the sidemost shalish etzbais is always a problem. You can't do a sewing repair. But according to Rav Amram, it's only a problem if a piece tore off completely. But if a piece tore and it's still partially attached, no problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if it's still somewhat attached, kosher. Ritzayin lamar. What the Bechar wants to say is, afilu atzitzit shahayu ba'be'esh nikra. You had the tzitzits in the corner of the garment. The corner ripped off, but not completely. It's still hanging. It's still kosher. The yesh machmirin bazeh. However, the Mishnah Berurah says there are those that are machmir. Again, who's machmir? The Taz. Taz is very machmir over here lately. With Svir Lahu, the Taz holds the mifsalu hayishanim, that the tzitzits that are there when the beged rips become puzzle, because once it rips, and it rips to a point where its connection to the beged is less than shalish etzbais, now we view it as if it's detached. And remember, according to the Taz, if it's detached, it becomes puzzle. And according to the Taz, you cannot reattach a corner back onto its original beged. According to the Magen Avraham, you can, but according to the Taz, you can't. So v'tzarech la'atila mechadash, you would have to undo the tzitzits and put them back on achar atvira after you do the repair. V'ayin b'bir halacha. Okay. Tezvav. The Yeshayimrim. Then we have the explanation of the Nemukei Yosef of Rav Amram. The Nemukei Yosef said that according to Rav Amram, like this, in the first pshat in Rav Amram, we learn that if a section tears off the talis, and that section is less than gimel al gimel, it has no talis beged. Now you reattach it, it still has no talis beged. You can't put tzitzits in there. Even if you put new tzitzits on it after you reattach it, no good. Because you're attaching the tzitzits onto a part of the beged that's not there. It's command lesser dummy. The Nemukei Yosef learns not that way. The Nemukei Yosef learns, according to Rav Amram, if a strip tore off the tzitzits, and that strip is less than gimel etzbais, and now you reattach it, after you reattach it, you could put on new tzitzits and it'll be kosher. The only problem is the tzitzits that were on when it tore off, they became puzzle. And you can't simply reattach the strip with the tzitzits on. Because when it came off, those tzitzits became puzzle. You put them back on, tasav limud also. But you want to put on new tzitzits, that's okay, according to the Nemukei Yosef's pshat in Rav Amram. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Svir lahu, the Nemukei Yosef holds the tfira choshev chibur, that reattaching it is considered an attachment. The problem is the tzitzits that were on the strip when it got torn off. And what's the problem? Mishum tasav limud asli. It's a tasav limud asli problem. The strip tore off. Okay, while they're off, they're on a beged that has no chashivus. They're on a beged. Forget that it doesn't have a sheer talis. It's not even choshev beged. It's less than gimel on gimel. You want to reattach it? You can't reattach it. You got to take it off, do it over again. Vayin betaz techelik al shulchan aruch v'kasav delakuli alma maidim dim la'akesh etvari hitl b'tzitzis tekasha. V'chein kasav abach v'shir k'nes sagdel v'agra v'chein hiske bar tzachayim. Aval mikamakay lotzeis yidei dea harishayna yitvar tachas hakanav matlis sheyesh b'y shalish al shalish. Again, his eitzah is to be yaitza all the deis. So on a square, you have this issue, a strip tore off, you reattached it. Don't go ahead and follow the Nemukei Yosef. Put on a square of fabric that's more than gimel al gimel and attach the tzitzits to that. And finally, we come to his cut and tezayin yetzeis kulam ayurei shamayim should be yetze all the days. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Cain, therefore, Naihagin, we have the minig litvar b'chol kanaf me'atalis, to sew on to every corner of every talis chaticha shel beged shlema, an intact piece of beged mishalosh al shalosh that has the minimum size of 3 etzbais by 3 etzbais, so we know that the corner of the beged that has the tzitzits on it has a toiras beged. Mishum de bekama begadim, because on many begadim, motzo it is common sha'afiluim chadashim, that even if they're new, yesh b'hem tfira toich shalosh, there is a seam where a piece has been attached to the beged within 3 etzbais of the end of the beged. V'yesh psol l'das Rav Amram l'videi rishayna, and according to the first interpretation of Rav Amram's pirush, such a beged would be puzzle the Chanal B'Sif Cotton Yud Beis. Ice Cotton Yud Zayin, Hechad de Efsher, the Mechaber said Yirei Shemayim should be Yaitza all the days when it's possible. Hechad de Lo Efsher, if it's not possible, Naktinon, Disfaras Rav Amram Iker, the Gam de Tfira Choshev Chibur, we paskin Lamaisa, if you have a place where it's not Shaykh to be Yaitza all the days, Me'ikar Adin, he says, we paskin like Rav Amram. So we paskin like Rav Amram that the Isser of the Gemara in Menachos is talking about where a piece tore off. And Rav Amram says the issue is that if a piece tore off, you cannot reattach it, because if you reattach it, it doesn't constitute a reattachment. But it sounds like he's saying we paskin like the Yesh Oimrim in Rav Amram, the Nemukah Yosef shot Rav Amram, which is that if you reattach it and then you put tzitzits on it, that would be okay. It's only the tzitzits that were on it when it got detached that is considered puzzle. But if you put on new tzitzits, it would be okay. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This exclusive limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Shem should say Yeshua and first Parnasset should do Tol as need, and we should be Zeicha to the Bias Kol Tzedek b'mehera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.